All right, let's start, folks. How are you doing? Thursday of week one. Is time flying or what? Yeah. How are we feeling? Yesterday is usually, I think, where students start to feel that it's really picking up in terms of difficulty and pace. How is this cohort feeling about it? How are you guys feeling? Sounds about right. Are people feeling caught up with yesterday or not uncommon? People feeling like they still have some stuff to complete from last night or yesterday? Yeah, some stuff to complete. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's that juggling act of like, should I go forward or should I leave what I just didn't complete? Does a question? I mean, if you're talking about stretch work from yesterday, then I'm not worried. You know, and yeah, fair point around like it was fairly difficult stretch work, but I was talking even just to about the core work from yesterday, you know. What's nice though is that um, based on given that we're like one subject, right? And we're doing the fundamentals of that subject, you everything that we are working on, it's not like, oh, I didn't completely understand objects from yesterday, and I don't feel fully comfortable with using objects, so I guess like I'm not ready for today. Not really true. What's neat is all of these things that we're teaching you are like the fundamentals of programming in JavaScript, and even if you may not feel comfortable that day, the future days, even though the topics feel like they're moving on and we're moving away from objects now, we're not really moving away from objects. You're going to constantly use them, and you're going to continue practicing them through osmosis, right? And so it may actually be that even from a day one or day two, like Monday, Tuesday, something you're not comfortable with, you didn't even maybe finish, or you felt uncomfortable finishing, like you just saw somebody else's solution and you're like, okay, I guess I'll like implement something like that, but I don't fully understand what I just did. Um, but when you look at it on Friday or perhaps next week, my bet would be that you'll feel more comfortable with it because it's not like we've put that topic completely aside and have moved forward, right? So um, that's the whole like be comfortable being uncomfortable thing partly, as well as just the way our course is structured that everything builds on each other, which is nice. um, I want to talk a little bit. Today's about supposed to be about functions and callbacks, and we will definitely talk at length about those things. But before we get there, a little bit about me and my lecture style and what kind of how I approach things. I know we had a day one intro, which was really enjoyable. Thanks for all the quirky facts and everything. So as I mentioned in the intro, my name is Karam Virani, or KV. Um, Official title is Head of Education. I really focus on the curriculum experience. So the software is a big part of it, Compass as well. Um, as well as a little bit of behind the scenes management and things of that nature, and teaching less and less compared to previously. But still, I try to do one or two lectures a week. That's my kind of ideal that I can kind of do to stay connected and also get to know the students and, stay in touch with the curriculum. So that's me. My background is in programming. I'm a developer by trade. I took computer science in 2002, graduated 2005 from University of Guelph out in Ontario. And I just always knew I was going to get into programming. It wasn't like, hey, what should I do? I think I was like 8 or 10 years old when I started playing around. Actually started teaching other people computers, MS-DOS, those kinds of things. This wasn't in Canada. This was back where I grew up in Pakistan. So it was definitely a very different vibe in terms of computers and technology kind of picking up. But I was fortunate in that I had access to that and I was able to learn it. The internet, for me at least, came a little bit after that. Um, so that's me in a nutshell. Oh, I'm supposed to start with a joke. I like to start lectures with a joke where possible and try to make the joke relevant to whatever we're doing. In this case, it's fundamentals. So I don't have a specific topic-based joke, but I'll say I'll go with this one. How many software engineers does it take to screw on a light bulb? None. It's a hardware problem. Let the hardware people deal with those kind of problems. Very, very typical of like hardware people blaming software, software people blaming hardware. So that's my joke. In terms of my style of lecture, I definitely stay away from slides for the most part. You'll probably have already noticed that with the lectures as well, right? Other lectures don't tend to use too many slides. But that's not necessarily that the slides are a bad thing. It's just a stylistic choice, right? My goal here is to not just introduce you a topic like callbacks or functions. Functions you've already been introduced to, but like callbacks. I think that like lectures are a terrible way of like transferring like new knowledge. That's not the goal that I like to think of my lectures focusing on. There's actually been research done in terms of lectures and transferring of knowledge and quizzing people after lecture on the stuff that was just covered, and it doesn't go well. So I'm not expecting you to be fully like after lecture completely understand everything I went through. It's supposed to kick things off a little bit, and it's supposed to be a little bit of review as well. But really what I try to focus on, more than the topic itself and the bullets that you see in Compass, is the approach. Because one of the things that we really get to do here in this class is like solve problems together and get to see how we all solve problems together as much as possible. And also see how I solve problems, right? And impart some of those tricks and like approach steps versus the actual concept. You're gonna spend a full day on something like functions and callbacks, right? So I'm not worried about making sure that you're fully comfortable with them by the end of the lecture. That's not my goal. It shouldn't be your goal either. Is that fair? Definitely in terms of, you know, like using the editor and my tools of choice, and I deliberately like use certain keywords or use certain shortcuts as we've kind of covered a little bit in the early on, and I want to kind of highlight some of that as review as well as I go, right? But that's not the goal of the lecture. But really, just so you can kind of see, okay, this is how a developer that's been doing it for a while, this is what they feel is important. This is how they use their computers. This is how they use their editor. This is how they approach problems. Any kind of questions or thoughts or counterpoints or anything on that? I will have my, I'll try and do my best, and I generally do. Like I have a coffee or water with me, and I actually like do a lot of awkward pause, right? Like sometimes I'll say any questions and I'll awkward pause, or I'll just like awkward pause. And I do that deliberately because one of my pet peeves with instructors or lecturers previously has been that they don't pause enough for questions. They just say any questions and then wait for a few seconds and move on, right? And I'll try and do a little bit more of the intentional awkward pause. I try to own it, you know what I mean? So any kind of questions or thoughts? How have lectures been so far? Who have you had so far? You've had Nima, you've had Dawn, and have you had Sam? So no Sam yet? Yeah, Davey on day one, yep. Fair. Not a technical lecture, but totally hear you on that. And then who else? Those two only? Okay, and then myself. And then you'll have Sam and Carl and others in the future. So that'll be exciting. Hopefully they've been good lectures so far. Yeah, awesome. I have a lot to live up to then, I guess, eh? I was hoping you'd say, nah, they're not so good. Oh yeah, one more thing. I will try, like I don't know everybody's name, so if you ask questions or as you answer, you know, I'll try and ask you your name. I'll try and remember, but I have like really bad memory with names or just things in general in life. Terrible life skill of mine. But I will work on it. And also, if I do end up picking on you as like, hey, what do you think? And I'll point because I don't necessarily know your name. There have been many cases where I do that and somebody's caught off guard and kind of feels a little bit like, oh shoot, I wasn't listening. I was like, you said a word like 5 minutes ago that I was thinking about, or a concept that you covered, and I was just like, I was zoned out. I don't hold that against you because it's a 2-hour lecture. Like, it's hard to pay attention to someone talking for 10 minutes, let alone 2 hours. I'm obviously not going to talk at you for that long, but it's tough to pay attention. So I will not, let's just like out in the open, it's okay if you zone out. You don't have to like try to hide it. You can just say, sorry, I was zoned out. Can you like repeat the question? And that's totally okay. I'm not going to hold that against you or judge you for that reason. I tend to do it myself. Why should I judge you for that? Right? Is that cool? And it's my job, partly my job, to keep you engaged in the lecture. So I shouldn't get upset or angry if you guys are not doing that, right? Like I should adjust. So that's my philosophy on all of that. I think that's everything I wanted to say around kind of setting expectations. The biggest one is, the other one is, don't try to code along with me. Have you guys already tried that? Hopefully not. Hopefully that's been mentioned. Do not try to code along. We're coding together. We're pair programming essentially all together, right? There will be notes sent out with the code, so you'll find. Sometimes I take code that I wrote previously, but I tend to use the same code that I used previously. So it may have slightly different comments, but overall it'll be there, right? So far, so good? Oh, I also tend to talk really fast when I get excited. So feel free to reel me back in. It is something that I try to be deliberate with at lectures, but sometimes lose sight of as you know, as I work through the lecture. So feel free to like ask questions, just be like, hey, slow down, or hey, can you explain that again? Totally cool. So far, so good? Okay. Um, so I did the status check. I really want to talk a little bit of review before we get into functions, but it is related review and the important stuff. Stuff that maybe isn't even necessarily talked about enough in our curriculum, which is where another place where lectures really do help. The positive lectures, we can kind of be like, oh, this is a missing thing in the curriculum, or something that could be better. Let's cover that a little bit in lecture until we fix it. You know what I mean? And so we sometimes do that with lectures as well. And this might be one of those things, actually. I'm not sure. You remember this? Debugging exercise from Tuesday? Is that right? I'm just using it as an example. We're not going to solve it up here or anything. This is the original code. This is not the solved code, nor does that matter. I'm just bringing up a topic that I think is really important, which is how to read code. Especially code that you haven't, like all of a sudden is on a screen, and like you're supposed to be able to like start scanning it and understanding what it's doing. That's a real life skill. That's not just a classroom skill. Can you guess why code being thrown up on a screen or on your screen or your pair programmer's screen and you starting to read it, and it's not code that you wrote or you wrote it a long time ago, so it's pretty much foreign to you. Why is that an important skill as a developer? And one that will take time, but one that we should focus on. Yep. Name? Dana, right.
Because sometimes you get a job where you have to finish someone else's code who has left without him being present to explain what's going on.
Because you have to take over code, you inherit code all the time, right? Especially as juniors, we're going to be inheriting code when we go off into the real world, right? Absolutely. My question, though, is a little bit more specific. It's not about inheriting code onto your screen where you have time to read it. Although it is about that as well. I'm saying, as a subset of that, what about if it's up on the screen? Can you see that as a thing that happens in the real world? And it's not your screen necessarily. And you have to kind of understand the code. Maybe someone's up in like this kind of a setup. Can you think of that in the real world a little bit? I mean, you can guess as well. It's totally okay. In interviews, yeah, that's absolutely a great one. So in tech interviews, this may happen where somebody brings up some code and maybe it has some bugs, or maybe they want you to complete it, as you said, right? Or explain it, or criticize it. Talk about what you'd improve. So it could be a very common tech interview practice, right? You may not experience that in tech. It really depends. It's very random, right? Another example. It's not the only one. Yep.
Maybe it's a review of code that you've worked on previously.
Yes, a code review. So companies, oftentimes, depending on their culture and how their dev teams operate, sometimes it's not up on a screen like this, but sometimes it is. The person who just worked on a feature will put it up on a screen, and the small dev team that's working together on that particular product will be sitting on sofas or whatever, and will be listening to their presentation and they'll be going through their code, and they'll be explaining it. So there's the skill on how to present code, which is not something we focus on too much here, but you will see it a little bit. But then there's a skill that maybe needs to come before that, which is how to like receive the presentation, how to be able to read that code on screen and quickly follow along, right? This is where things like indentation and syntax highlighting do help, but there's more than that. The thing I want to focus on is how do you actually read the code, right? And so that one is not necessarily on screen, but generally, let's say you open this up on your computer, okay? Which you did 2 days ago. You open this up on your computer. How did you read this code? Because I use this as an example because it's probably one of the bigger code files that you come across, right? In our, at least so far in this week. There's going to be bigger than this, but like so far, this probably felt a little bit, did this kind of scare you a little bit? Go, whoa, what am I, this is kind of, whoa, right? You didn't have to write this much code, but you definitely had to like synthesize it. How did you, what was your strategy? I want to hear different strategies. There's not one right answer here. I'm going to tell you, by the way, one of my preferred ways, but that doesn't mean that that's the only way. I saw a couple hands go up in the back. Your name again?
Stella.
Stella, okay.
You follow along as if you are the machine, and so if you run into a function, you go and you read the function, run it, and then you go back.
So Stella's saying like you go and you read it as though you're the machine. So you don't actually necessarily read it like top down then, I guess? You're not reading like, maybe you're reading line 1, because the machine is also going to start with line 1. But you're not necessarily jumping into like these lines here then? You're kind of going, where are you going then? Where are your eyes landing next? but the if statement's inside the function. The machine's not executing that.
Yeah, okay. Well, maybe I
Well, you're a human, right? So you don't have to exactly do what JavaScript would do. But I like your answer. Anybody else? Yep. In the back. That's more of a debugging tactic or just a reading tactic? Or understanding what the code is supposed to be doing or why it's not working tactic? In terms of reading each function. I like that approach, especially for debugging, where it's like, I don't know where the bug is, but it's in one of these 3, 4 functions. Let's maybe analyze each of them, especially the smaller ones first, maybe for low-hanging fruit, to see if like, is it behaving the way it's supposed to? How do you actually test that the function is behaving as it's supposed to? Let's say, is multiple, like right here. But how? Like, should I just call the function? Like, is that what you mean, or? Yeah. Whoops. Yeah, I mean, you could also just open up REPL and literally paste that function in there. And if the function is kind of isolated in that it just takes input and returns a value, it doesn't have any side effects, it's not looking at some outside scope, then you can just test that function out, right? Not true for all functions, right? And so I can just now use isMultiple, which is a function, and pass in something, right? And just see how it's behaving. I'm testing the function out. And before I run, before I hit enter, I hopefully have a hypothesis of what's going to happen and then see if it was true or not. Yeah, so is that what you were saying? Yep. Or perhaps you're kind of doing both tactics, right? Stella's and yours, where you're reading the code as it's being executed as the runtime itself, not just top bottom. And then as you're finding a function that you're like, intuition kicks in. I want to know what this thing does. I don't fully understand. Or I think there's a mistake here. Let's try and play with it a little bit. Can't do that for all the functions because they might be really coupled with the environment and you might not be able to just paste it into Node. That's kind of where another kind of skill and intuition comes in. How can I reduce this into something I can experiment with? Absolutely. Any other thoughts? Yep.
I actually use my text editor and shrink all my functions so that all you see is the function and the name of the function.
Uh-huh.
And then I see what those exactly. So then I see the list of the functions that are messaged as the base functions,
Yeah.
and then see what we're trying to actually accomplish with those
So when you
functions.
say base functions, I assume you mean the ones that kind of kick things off.
Exactly.
So kind of reading, you kind of have to be able to read the code to be able to know which one is the one that's being kicked off, right? Similar to what Stella was saying, okay, like here's a function. I'm not going to read the contents of it, collapse it completely until I need to. This is what JavaScript does. It has no idea what's in there until it needs to execute it. And that was going to be the main point I kind of cover. So great answer for the first answer. Usually it doesn't go that way. Usually someone goes, I kind of read top down. And I say, well, that can work, but it should not be your entire tactic, ideally. Right? You want to use, obviously, you want to read linearly in some cases. For example, when you're reading the inside of this function, you want to be like, okay, I would see a bunch of variables here, so they get declared, and then I have this if statement. I'll come back to these variables, but I'm going to pretend that they executed, right? And then I'm going to look at what this if statement does and then jump up. But yeah, absolutely, collapsing functions is a great way. I prefer to use indentation. So I guess I never really got into the habit of collapsing functions, but that's totally a fair approach. Um, Indentation, though, is not something you should take lightly, right? I'm assuming some of you have asked for help from a mentor, and they've looked at your code and said, actually, before I help you, or as I'm helping you, can you fix these indentation issues? Has that happened to anybody yet? No, not yet, but maybe your indentation is great. But in your case, it has happened, and it's very common in the first week, second week, where you're still not used to exactly how to indent things, or you don't prioritize it enough. But when it comes to scanning code, the collapse is a great way to do it, but when you don't have control over collapse or you don't have that option, the indentation really kicks in, right? Really important. Any other suggestions or thoughts on how to read code? Yep.
I usually focus on the arguments of each function and then see how the function is returning it.
Yeah, absolutely. What is the actual goal of the function, which is what it returns, but also how does it operate? So not just maybe the long contents of it, but what does it take in and what does it return? That's kind of the definition of the function, right? That's a great answer as well. And also, yes, we should read it as though we're JavaScript. I agree. That was going to be my point. But it doesn't mean that we don't take advantage of our like intuition. Like when I see something that's named calculate day and year, JavaScript doesn't know what the hell those characters mean, but we do, right? It's English, and so we can potentially make assumptions based on that and then validate those assumptions afterward, right? Great answers. Any others that I haven't covered? The other thing I see students get tripped up on when it comes to either reading their own code or other code is code that is in one line and has multiple nested expressions. When I say multiple nested expressions, can someone explain what that means? You may have to guess. Vanna? Did I say your name right?
Yeah.
Okay.
If it has multiple like if statements and then if this is true then return this so
It could be a ternary if, like with the question mark and the colon, yes. But it doesn't have to be. Um,
or maybe if it's like a function inside a function.
yes. So is that what you were going to say? Something similar to that? That can also be a thing. Now, nested, though, implies that they're inside of each other, right? So it's kind of similar to what you were saying is what I was visualizing is like console.log is a function call. But within that, I'm calling my function. Right? And yes, two levels, maybe we're feeling comfortable with that. Are we feeling comfortable with like if I see a console.log, but inside of console.log, it's not a value, it's another function call. Feeling comfortable with that? But that can happen like 4 or 5 levels, right? Inside that function call that's inside console.log, there's another function call for the first argument. Right? And of course, if there's too many of these, this becomes like we become cross-eyed. We're like, oh, this is like too much nesting in one line. Can we not separate these out into separate lines and then just pass them as values? Yes, we can, right? Yes, we can. But you know, you may encounter like 2 or 3 levels of nesting, 3, 4 levels of nesting of that kind, and they may include a ternary operator or something of that nature as well, right? Are we good with this? So key takeaway here is don't fall into too much of the habit, in my opinion, and this is an opinion, of just scanning a long file top to bottom. Find the shortcuts. One shortcut is to read the code as though it would execute. So I would actually not look at this function and collapse it as you were saying. I realize another function definition. I would note that that is a function, and I would note that it takes in 2 parameters and it returns something, but I don't really care about it until I get there. And so I really see that actually the first function that's called is calculate day and year, and then I would go through that function. And yes, there's a valid month function inside that function. Holy moly. But I don't really need to read it or worry about it until it's called, right? And so I kind of want to look at, oh, there's a bunch of function declarations here. Okay, I could look at them, but really I want to know it, where are they called? Oh, valid month. Okay, so valid month is called, which is right here. Valid day is called right here, and so on and so forth, right? And then you kind of trace those functions and then go back to the line that called them. How many people were already doing this? Only a few of you, right? Maybe half. Maybe some people didn't raise their hands, but like, it's something that I do see as a thing to work on in week 1. Right? Especially, and this is not just code you inherit. This is code that you just wrote, but you're like, I don't understand why it's not working. Same practice, in my opinion. All right, let's move on from that review topic. Functions. Code on the screen. Got to read it quickly and understand what it's doing. If I run this file, what do you hypothesize will be the output? Undefined? Yep. It'll say hello, whatever argument you pass. What argument am I passing? Right, but yeah, what goes between the parentheses of the name? What in this case, what will say hello? Yeah, I'm running this file right now with node space file name. Nothing's gonna happen. It'll literally not output anything, or as you said, undefined. Sally, did you have something to add? Function is not being called. Which file is this? 1. So this is another important thing, is have these like assumptions and then validate them. This is kind of like the scientific approach to software development, right? You're correct. No output, right? Nothing. But you assume if you're calling the function, then yes, you'll see something. Anyway, that's a digression. I try to do those. But really, we're going to be talking a little bit about functions. So here's a function. Very simple, right? Does this function return a value? It doesn't have the return keyword in it. By default, if a function doesn't have a return keyword in it, what does it return? Undefined, as you said, right? And so does that mean that if I do greet, first of all, when I call greet, I need to pass in an argument? Is that a true statement? I need to pass in an argument? I can actually not pass in an argument because JavaScript's cool with that. Strange language. Other languages, most languages would not be cool with that, but JavaScript is. Right? And so the side effect of this function is that it does something to the terminal. It'll print something out to the terminal, but it doesn't actually return anything. Agreed? So I expect to see, when I run this, what do I expect to see? A console log saying hello KV, right? Yes? Nice. How can I validate that it has returned undefined? Because what it printed is not what it returned. We agreed earlier that it returns undefined. But it does have a side effect, which is to console log to the screen. Different question than what I'm asking, which is what if we don't put anything inside the parentheses, or are you suggesting that as an answer? So if you don't put in, it's a good question. If I don't put anything inside of here, right here, right? You're saying, what do I expect to happen? So how do you follow this? Well, similar to Stella's approach, like I'm gonna read. Okay, there's a function there, but like here's where I'm calling the function, and I'm passing in nothing into the function. So what do I expect when it's being called when I get to line 7? This is gonna be. It's not defined, therefore the value for that in JavaScript is undefined. And so I will expect to see hello space. The value is not a string, but if you try to convert it to a string, it'll be the word undefined, potentially. Or it might be empty string, depending on the language. In this case, it's undefined, and maybe Ruby, it will just be hello, because it depends on the language in terms of what it decides to change the type of undefined to, right? But that doesn't really help us with my question, which is, how do I know what the greet function itself is returning? Yep, and name? Benita? You can console log the function call, exactly. So here I'm going to restore what I had and console log the function. And this is what I was talking about with nested expressions. I am reading the inside of this first, like in kind of like a, I don't know, what's a good expression for like, is it an onion? There's layers in there, right? Or a Russian doll, huh? Yeah. There's one clone inside the other, right? In this case, there's expressions inside of expressions. They may be different. In the Russian doll case, it's the size, right? But in this case, they actually do different things. And we're essentially looking at the inner one first, and then we're looking at what's the value of that, and then what's being passed into the one that's outside of it. So here, what I'm saying is whatever the value is, my eyes, when I see this, should actually replace this with whatever this is returning. So we said this is returning undefined. Therefore, my eyes actually, as I get accustomed to reading code that's nested like this, I actually see this. One could argue. And this is what I'd like you to kind of start practicing as well. Right? It'll take some time. So this is like, I have left it in there just to prove a point. Like, here's the undefined. Here's me undoing that and saving. And when I run that, well, there's of course the console log that will occur once I call the function. And then there's the console log of what the return value of that function was. So the sequence there is we call the function, which then does the console log, and then it returns nothing, and we try to print what it returns, which is nothing, undefined. Are we comfortable with this? Yeah? Okay. Now, I have this other variable up here just to kind of talk about it as a talking point. We can take variables and assign them values, yes? Can I do the same thing with functions? I mean, the name of the file should be a hint. Functions is values. So what if I do this? And the what if I do this should also be a thing in your arsenal, right? Especially as you're learning a new language or a new paradigm, which is happening right now. Right? So what if I do this? Instead of just following the assignment or the tutorial that's telling you to do things in this way, you should be able to take a step back and be like, what if I do this? And also have a hypothesis. I think this will happen. But it's okay to be wrong there. Now I know, or we ought to know, that if I do it this way, what do I expect the value of say hello to be? We already console logged it. It's undefined. We just assign it to a variable, which we could then console log. Same deal. Right? But that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, what happens if we don't call the function and just refer to it? And try to like, maybe even console log it. You know, forget the variable for a second. What happens if I console log, not greet kv, but just greet? What if I do that? Have you tried this already? Not quite, right? Yep, name? Nick? Yeah, so you're answering the thing that I just commented, undefined variable? Yeah, but you know, in order to answer what will this variable have as a value, perhaps what I can do is console log the value to see. And if you're saying it should be undefined, that means I should see console log undefined here. Right? But I don't think I'll see that. I think what I'll see is, hey, that's a function. You didn't call it, so it's actually the function itself, just like a variable that points to an object, or a variable that points to an array, or that points to a number in this case, where with x is 5. So really, it's saying, yeah, you got a function there. You able to see this in the back with the font size? Yeah. So that's interesting. So right now, I should be able to build a stronger hypothesis based on my console logging of that value. So that means that if I do this in 2 steps, where I actually assign it to a variable first, and then console log that variable, I'm effectively doing the same thing, am I not? Right? I just have a handle on it, and then I console log that handle. Handle's another not so common way of referring to these things. Or pointer is the more technical term that you may have come across. A variable is a pointer to a thing, right? It points to the function. And then I'm console logging said function, say hello. So what do I expect here? I expect the same output because all I've done is just break that one line into 2 lines. I've broken this one line into 2 lines. Agreed? Are you guys just nodding or actually agreed? Because I definitely default nod sometimes. Like he asked a question, yeah, nod. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Like why we're doing this is a little bit harder to explain right now because I'm kind of focusing on a little bit more of the like, let's understand. Yeah, the how, I guess. Yeah. And so, but definitely this whole lecture is not going to be that tactic because I'm not a fan of that tactic. It's better to go like, here's a problem. Let's see what kind of solutions we have. Unfortunately, I'm not taking that approach for the first half of the lecture, if that's cool. I was actually going to speak to that right after this, so that's good. Not right after this, but soon after this. Any other comments or questions? How's my pace? It's okay? Not talking too fast, right? Yeah, so in terms of like, and nodding and saying, yeah, I agree that this expression here, these 2 expressions, these 2 lines, are essentially going to have the same result as this line that I've commented out, which did it all in one step. Console log the value of the function. Instead, assign the value of the function to a variable, console log the variable. Is this something that we're familiar with as a way to break one nested expression into two separate expressions or lines? It makes sense, yeah? And I was talking earlier about you could have 3 or 4 of these like onions or layers of the onion, and you could break it out. Yes, we can. We can break it out into multiple lines. This is the strategy that you would take. Take the inner thing, in this case greet, that's being passed into console log, assign it to a variable, even though that's not necessary, and then use that variable right after. It may help you conceptually understand what that really complicated line is actually doing, right? Yeah. Yep. Name is Reza? Reza? Yep. That's a really good question. We can experiment with that as well. Oh, the word function here? Like that? That will be, my understanding is that would be invalid as JavaScript. So that would be a syntax error, is my guess, but I'm not 100% confident. I'm pretty confident. Anybody else want to take a guess? We just remove. Why did you ask that? I mean, that's not a bad question, but I'm curious what led to that question. Yeah. Oh, I see what you're getting to. I think what you're getting to is something I will cover next. But in this case, the way you're doing it, I think will result in an error. That's my hypothesis, that line 6 is a syntax error. So this is valid JavaScript. It's like, yeah, you're trying to call greet, but hey, trying to call greet and then curly brackets. Oh, it looks like you're trying to define. Oh, I'm confused, right? And so that's how it's saying that. It didn't expect a open mustache. I like to call these open stashes because it looks like a sideways mustache. And then closed stash for closed sideways mustache. Nobody else calls it that, I don't think. So hopefully that result was something you understood. Yeah. Yep. Square brackets is what I say. But for round brackets, I don't say brackets. I say parentheses. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of people say curlies. Yeah, curly brackets. Totally. Open stash, closed stash, mustaches. We'll see if it sticks, All of a sudden everybody in Vancouver is talking about open stash and closed stash. As every developer that goes through here hears about M being open stash, closed stash. Any questions or comments or thoughts so far? So what do we expect now, given that it's the same line broken into two? What was the previous output? Function, my function, function something, right? I cleared it. This is a bad habit of mine. Command K on Mac clears the terminal, which is great for when I'm working, but like when I'm lecturing, sometimes I want to scroll up and show something, right? But it's a habit. Okay, so we saw function, and so when I run this, I expect to see the same thing. So interesting. Say hello as a variable that actually points to the greet function. How many functions do I have here now? 2 is a good guess. But another good guess would be 1. 3? Where did you, what makes you say 3? There's greet. There, oh, that's a function call. That's a fair point. You win. But console log is a function call. I meant how many of our functions are here. Yeah. So is it 2, 3, 1, 0? No, that won't be 0. Huh? 1? What makes you say 1? 1 and 2 are both good guesses. But the correct answer is 1. There's a 1 function here. What made you say that?
There's literally just one function called read that does something, and then we're assigning that function to a variable.
Yeah, we're assigning a function to a variable. The other clue is when I output the function, it's not saying function say hello. The function is still the greet function. See that? So there's really just one function here. And if you were to run this in Python Tutor, are you guys familiar with Python Tutor? Yeah, it was shown to you by Nima. Nice. It's a pretty cool tool, right? Don't Don't, it's not something you'll use in your career over time. It's a good learning tool. Don't become too dependent on it because you should be doing that visualization in your head eventually with more and more complicated code, right? But if I was to put this in Python tutor, I would have one function and two arrows pointing to it. Greet as well as say hello. So in other words, even this greet here is kind of like a pointer to the function. Because I can console log greet, right? Like I saw that it said function, and when I console log say hello, it said the same function. It's interesting. So what happens if I do this? Can I do that? I didn't define say hello as a function, but I assigned say hello to be the greet function. So I should be able to do that because it's the same thing, right? And my hypothesis would be, this will say, let's get rid of this console log. This will actually do hello kv, just like if we were to just call greet. Instead, we're calling say hello. Is any of this like confusing? Did anybody's mind just go like, no? Maybe? Yeah, a little. Oh, wow. Already. The lecture's barely started. Already blowing minds. Yeah, it is a bit different than what you maybe would have expected, or something you didn't even maybe think to try, right? Because like, why? Why is this important? Why is Kate even talking about this? And that's what we're going to build on this lecture, right? And then we will approach it from a problem perspective. Come again? Yeah, exactly. What is the point? Yeah. Yeah, so the next question is WTF, right? You know what WTF stands for? What's this for? Right? That is clearly the meaning of WTF, right? So yeah, that is something we're gonna talk about. I don't know if it's what we're talking about right away though. Anonymous functions, no. But very soon. But I want to build on it a little bit before I answer that, if that's okay. We're at 9:45, so actually what we'll do is we'll take a quick break. 9:45. Let's take a 5-minute. Keep it a little bit short because this lecture is, and I'm a bit rusty. I tend to go a little bit long. So we'll take a 5-minute instead of a 10-minute, and we'll resume at 10 a.m. or 9:50 a.m. Okay, so um, we learned that in the previous file functions as values, we learned that we could actually assign a function to a variable and then console log it. And we could then call it later if we want. So let's just take a step back and just see what we did here between line 6 and 12. Right? I talked about the approach of like taking a particular expression and breaking it into two. Right? Can I do the opposite? If I have two, can I combine them into one for the most part? Like for example, in this case, what are my two steps? I declare a function called greet, and then I assign it to a variable. 2 steps. Can I not just do those together? Because I can declare a variable and assign it a value at the same time, can't I? I'm doing that right here. Right? But like this could also be 2 lines. This would have been the 2-line version. I had it only in 1 line. Declare the variable and assign it a value at the same time. And so that's what I'm going to talk about right here in this another file is, well, I've got this, but can't I just do that? Isn't that the same thing I did earlier except in 2 steps, where I first declared the function greet and then later on assigned say hello to be the value of greet? It seems like a reasonable thing to do. And now what's confusing about this? Go ahead. Yeah, it's kind of got 2 names. This is valid JavaScript because we've combined 2 expressions together that are valid expressions. And declaring a variable and assigning it a value, and we've agreed that functions are values that we can assign. And so this is the right side, this is the value. This is valid. Just like this is valid. Right? And let's just confirm that. I'm going to console log file2. Oh, sorry, node file2. No error. No syntax error. And what I expect when I console log say hello, what do I expect here? We've done it before, but just as a recap, what do I expect here? The function. Yeah, just it's hey, you're trying to console a function out. So I'm just going to describe it to you. And then the function's name is still the same, greet. It's interesting, right? What happens if I do this? Because there's confusion here. And I definitely can't do the left side, like var equals. That's not valid. You need to give the variable a name. So I guess what I'm going to do is remove that. And that's also valid in JavaScript. Let's try that out. Interesting. So this here is actually also a valid expression, as long as it's being assigned or being passed in. Because you're not giving that function a name, it's called an anonymous function. It's unnamed. But because you've just also assigned it to a variable right there, Node is being smart and just saying, oh, by the way, when you defined it, you called it say hello. Even though we didn't technically call it say hello, it's anonymous. But it's being friendly towards us so that we can debug easier by saying, oh yeah, and I guess it's say hello because that's the first variable you assigned it to. Right? So it's a bit misleading in terms of its output. It would have been better, in at least my explanation, if this said anonymous. Right? I'm curious actually if I tried to run this in DevTools. Right? You're familiar with DevTools a little bit from the prep course? Right? You know that there's a console here that can run JavaScript, I believe. You're familiar with that? Right? I can paste, just like the Node REPL, I have a REPL here. You know, if I do 5 plus 5, I get the value out. In fact, it tries to be smart and do it. You know, it's a little bit more helpful. So you kind of got to have a Node REPL here, different environment, and so slightly different output for things, different color, different syntax highlighting. So if I paste this out here, notice that it doesn't output function greet. It actually shows you the function code. So slightly different output if you're curious to try out these different comparisons. But ultimately the same thing that, hey, you just console logged a function, but the way I'm going to describe it to you is actually the full source code of that function in case you want to read it. Right? Slightly more helpful. And also notice that it doesn't say anything about say hello here. It's just, hey, that's a function. Whoops, sorry. That's a function, and it doesn't have a name. There's no like and nothing following the f here. Why? Again, WTF? Why is this important? And so we're going to talk about that very, very soon. But park it in your brain as like a thing that you know as is something you can do with JavaScript. Cool? Any questions? I will say that this is a function declaration in terms of our terminology, as we've commonly seen and used. And then this is considered a function expression, just to be able to identify which style you're using. I'll also say at this point that there are different style guides. Some companies will say that this is how we declare functions in our code, because functions are everywhere in our code. So we should have a general consensus on how we want to define them. And other companies will say, actually, this is a better approach. And we want to take this approach. And anytime we define functions, we're going to define them this way, as a function expression. Because the end result, at least in terms of being able to call the function and how it behaves, is the same. Right? So it's a stylistic approach with slightly different behavior that's not worth talking about right now. It's too like advanced or slightly too advanced. Right? You can write that down as part of your notes, saying like, okay, if you talked about declarations versus expressions, I want to research that. Maybe that's like stretch homework for me. That's fine. That's the kind of note taking I expect you to be doing in your markdown files, right? Okay. So with that said, let's talk about this next exercise here. Here's 3 not realistic but real world functions that have something in common, and I want you to read them. We talked about reading functions earlier. And tell me what they have in common. Somebody who hasn't raised their hands or answered yet. Somebody whose name I don't know. I want that person to hopefully try and attempt answering my question, which is, no, not Joel, which is, what is the commonalities between, what is the commonality between all 3 of these functions? You're repeating your name? Andrew? Andrew's saying you're repeating going into the kitchen, right? In this case, it's just a console log statement to go into the kitchen, because all we're doing is describing what we're doing. But that could be a more intricate set of instructions, right? So we have to pretend that that's the case because we're working with small amounts of code here. So we're repeating going into the kitchen multiple times. So that piece of code, whether in this case it's just a console log, but it could have been a more intricate thing, let's assume that's 10 lines of code, is being repeated here. Right? How do I, and you should be able to answer this question, even forgetting everything that we've talked about so far, how do I refactor this to be less repetitive? Refactor is a term we're familiar with, right? What does refactor mean, first of all? Are we familiar with that term? Am I making a false assumption here? It means, what does refactor mean is my first question. I take back what I asked earlier. Yeah, redesigning your code such that the behavior doesn't change, but that the way the code is written changes so that it is better, cleaner. In some cases, fewer lines of code. In some cases, more lines of code. Really depends on your goal. But really to make it, perhaps the more important goal is to make it more maintainable, more manageable, and more understandable, right? Okay, so how do we do that? And I think a hand went up here. Yep. Yeah, exactly. So we define a function called go to kitchen, and it does the console log itself, and then we just call that function inside of these. Right? This is a thing that we've probably practiced a little bit already in terms of, oh, a function can call another function. So, and if that particular thing is being repeated in 3 places, you know, let's just take those lines of code and move it into their own function and call that function. Question or comment? That is a good question. What about what we saw with the example that I brought up earlier, where we had functions inside of functions declared, not just executed? Um, so if I just take these and actually move them inside of here, essentially, and fix the indentation, what will happen is that I won't be able to call them from outside. Do you know why? It's not the topic we're talking about, but it has to do with scope. Outside, there's only one function available, which is go to kitchen. So what we're doing when we're putting function declarations instead of other function declarations, we're just saying it's only useful inside of this function. But that's not true. We want to be able to call those outside, right? Question, yeah? Name again? Sebastian. So have all these 3 functions defined inside of the go to kitchen function, as Raza was saying. Then what are you saying then? I suppose, but it wouldn't be something that you would normally do as a pattern. Yeah. No, it's yeah. The reason you put it in the function is to make sure that it doesn't need to be accessed by outside. So you're actually doing it deliberately to reduce the amount of functions you have at this level, at the outer level, by hiding them inside a function and not being able to access them. Yeah, at that point, yeah, exactly. But you can assign functions to objects, as you'll see, or as you've already seen yesterday, right, with the music library, right? And that whole like assigning functions to object properties is also an example of assigning them to variables, right? Passing them around as values, right? So this is an acceptable way to refactor this, but there is another way. Because what would be a nice philosophy to apply to my code generally with functions is functions should do one thing. And they should be good at doing that one thing. And then we should have other functions that do one thing, right? And so on. I would argue that these function names don't really change. Because these functions are still going to the kitchen and refilling coffee. They're just delegating that going to the kitchen part to another function. Right? Do you see what I'm saying? So I have one function that's very specific and does one thing, but then I have others that still do 2 things and they just leverage that go to kitchen function. Another way to do this is actually not this, so I'm going to comment this out, is to actually go to kitchen right? Something like that. Where actually I flipped it. Where now my generic function is actually going to do the console log of going to the kitchen. And then it will call the thing that's passed in, which is something that's a little bit unfamiliar perhaps right now. Because remember, we talked about, well, functions can be assigned to values. Functions can be attached to object properties, as we saw yesterday. So therefore, functions can be passed in to functions as well. And this is a pretty big strength of languages like JavaScript, which treat functions as a first-class value, as a first-class thing. Allow you to pass them around. It enables something known as functional programming, where a lot of it has to do with dealing with functions as values and passing functions around. So how would I call a function like that? That takes in a function itself as its first and only value. I'm not going to be, let's say I'm calling it, right? So go to kitchen and now I'm supposed to pass in a thing. But if I pass in 5, that's not a function. Let me comment out everything else so we can run this file.
Actually, just before you continue, can you be more specific as to what do you want? Like, what is this program doing? What is it asking the user to input?
There's no input in this particular program. It's really just for example. But it's a good question. So in this case, I'm just showing some functions that do something. They're not returning any values. They're having side effects. So they're console logging. But that's really just to be placeholders for some complicated logic that does something, right? It could have been functions that do values as well, like that actually return values. But in this case, when you see this, it looks simple, but it could be something that's a little bit more complicated that's doing a bunch of work, right? Instructing a robot on how to walk to the kitchen. And so you can pretend that I'm programming a robot, perhaps. Is that a better analogy? So
I thought that we were like talking to a user and he has to like say, oh, I want to like drink coffee or walk.
it could be that too. I mean, ultimately it doesn't matter, but let's, for the sake of like grounding the analogy, we'll say that we are writing the functions that a robot would have, that other users would be able, that other developers would be able to call. How's that? So this is like our robot that can move around, and we can do that, right? And so now I'm saying, instead of having different functions like this that you can define, that we have to define on the robot, let's define a generic function like this. Are you with me still? Or have I lost some people? Lost people? No? Okay. So go to kitchen and do this. Right? That seems to read like what it's doing, what it's saying. And then here, I was, showing that I can't just pass in a primitive value like a 5 or a string. What would happen actually? We should experiment with that. And this is actually another point I'd like to make during especially my first lecture with the cohort is, it's good practice to deliberately cause errors. Or what you think may cause an error, why do you think that's a good practice to do and something that you should do more of as you're learning a new language or a new framework or a new paradigm? I see a hand go up. Any others? Why do you think it's good to be like, I don't think this will work, but I'm going to make it do that thing anyway, and I'm going to have a hypothesis, and you are expecting it to not work, on the path to making it work? Yeah. If you can break it efficiently, then you can build it efficiently. Sure. Name? Hunter. I like that. Other reasons? Yep. Your name? Gurpreet. Yep. To see what error it throws, to get comfortable with errors in that particular language, because it may be different than other languages. It may not even error like you think it would, right? One of the things you probably noticed in your first few days or in the prep course is, oh my gosh, I see a lot of errors, right? And what happens when you see an error that you didn't expect? I would bet that you get a little bit, whether you do it consciously or subconsciously, you get a little bit discouraged or anxious, or both. Because our society has trained us that when we see an error that we've done a bad thing, We see red on the screen. We did something wrong. Bad. That is not, I want to reprogram you a little bit. That is not how developers ought to think. That is not how developers work or think. And one of the ways to champion that is to actually deliberately cause errors and do experiments with them so that you are causing errors on your own terms as much as possible, but not always. And getting familiar with those error messages that maybe you would have encountered later, but unknowingly, right? So you're kind of learning about not just the successful execution of code, but also how does this language behave when something doesn't go well in this particular example. So it's about learning the errors and also getting comfortable with the idea that errors are not a bad thing. So those two objectives, in my opinion. So I expect this to error because here we're trying to call the number 5. So it's like doing this, right? Which I expect will be some kind of an error. Let's run it. Node. Whoop. What am I doing? Node 3 callback intro. I think the error will be something like, it is not a function. So what are you trying to do here? That's my hypothesis. It's a type error, right? I expected a different type than what I got. So what we need to do here is not pass in a string or a number, but we need to actually pass in something that can be invoked or be called, because these two parentheses means that you're invoking or calling that thing, and that's functions. So we need to pass in a function, right? Now remember that I can define a function anonymously or with a name. So we'll start with the name, but then we'll refactor it. So let's say we're implementing the refill coffee. We don't have to say go to kitchen here. We're just doing the refill coffee here. Right? And now I can actually, because we know that we can refer to these functions, and we saw earlier that we can just, don't call the function, just pass it in. See the difference? It's the handle to the function or the pointer to the function that I'm passing into the go to kitchen and function. Am I going too fast? Missing a parenthesis there. So let's walk through the logic there, the control flow. Because again, just like we talked about at the beginning of this lecture, reading this code, the way it executes, as Stella pointed out, pretty important thing to force yourself to do so that it becomes a habit, right? So who wants to walk me through what this code will do between lines 8 and 17? What will JavaScript actually execute in order? I want exact order. So I want line numbers being set out, and then why? Name again? Seb, right. Seb, why don't you walk us through? So pretend this is the entire file. So it'll execute line 8? Okay. Yep, that's correct, line 8. It won't execute it, so it just jumps to line 13. Perfect. Right. Right. Yeah. So hold on for a second. Here on line 17, it's doing two things, right? Because we're calling a function and we're referring to a function, right? Agreed? We're referring to refill coffee and we're calling go to kitchen. So in order to call the function go to kitchen and, will it run refill coffee? It's a trick question. No, it won't, right? I'm not saying it will run refill coffee because we're not running refill coffee. This is running refill coffee, right? It's just referring to it. It's not calling it, right? But it is two things here. One is refer, and so it's saying, okay, let's take this function. It's literally in its head, taking this function and pasting it in here. Remember, in my head, I see the thing pasted where I'm passing it in, where it's being referred. So I've pasted it in there in my head, and that's what I'm seeing. It's a bit more complicated to read. That's why we like to see it like this, right? And then you're right. Then it calls that function, which is the go to kitchen and. So do you want to continue from there? Yep, and so what is the value of this? It's the function here, right? So that's what we need to keep in our head as well. We need to picture that do this is a reference to this refill coffee function. Okay, and then of course it runs the console log as a result. And then when do this is called, which line is it going to? Line 14. Nailed it. Do we understand this? So the sequence is call go to kitchen and, which will then call refill coffee. Yeah. We did that in our first example. The question is, what happens if I did put parentheses in line 17? We did that in the very first file where we said, well, yeah, but like, what if I console log, not just the value of greet, which we tried right here, but we console log, because that is also a function call, isn't it? Console log. But instead of greet, which is the value of the function, we did this. Well, what was this being turned into? Whatever was being returned by that function. Because the function's called before this function is, before the outer function is called, right? I'm going to leave that commented out. And so, coming back to our example, if we call this function, then we're not passing the function in, we're passing the return value of the function in. Agreed? So what does refill coffee return? Undefined. So really you're just passing in undefined. That is my hypothesis. And that is a good question because I want you to start getting, like, asking that and experimenting it. So if you were at this point on an assignment, you would go, I'm not sure, or I believe it's this, even though the assignment's not telling me to do this, I'm going to try it. And then you would find that it's saying undefined, and that what happens when you try to call undefined? I'm guessing it'll say something like undefined is not a function, just like it would say 5 is not a function, right? Let's try it out. It's a good experiment. Right here, this is returning undefined, and therefore this is becoming undefined, and running that, actually passing in undefined, it's saying, well, do this is not a function because it's called do this at this point. And then if I do what you were suggesting, which is the same thing, I will see it again complain that, you know, it's not a function. Coming back to this code, are we okay with the control flow that Seb read out for us here and what's happening? So what are we expecting here? We're expecting the same behavior that we saw earlier, right? Going to the kitchen and refilling the coffee. And now I could have other functions that are just doing the one thing. They're not doing going to the kitchen and. They're just the instructions on how to go to the machine and refill coffee. And they don't care about, as long as they're called in the context of where there's a coffee machine, we're good. So now if we have a coffee machine elsewhere, like perhaps on the DevHub side, we can say, we can call refill coffee once we take the robot to DevHub, because maybe there's a coffee machine there. It's not a very specific kitchen coffee machine problem anymore, or implementation anymore. So the function has become a lot more, because it's only a single purpose, it's become a lot more clean and less dependent on being in the kitchen. And we could have many of these, right? Like wash dishes, or I don't know, whatever it may be, right? And they're just single purpose. So what we've done here is we've used our previous knowledge that I gained in the previous exercises that you were asking about to point out that because functions have values, I can solve a problem differently than just what we did earlier, where we just call the function over and over, the base function. We actually flip it, and we have a base function that can take in what to do next. I'm going to pause there to make sure that if you have questions about that, it is a good time to ask, because we will use this for another exercise that's more practical. Actually, before we do that, 2 steps, right? Declare the function that you're going to pass in and then pass it in. Well, if you're not going to use refill coffee more than once, why even bother giving it a name? And so this is where these anonymous functions are often seen like this. And this is actually how JavaScript code is often written. And so you may find this a little bit jarring at first, but it's something you're going to get comfortable reading and writing. Because all I did was It was originally a name, right? And the name was pointing to a function, and I literally took that function without the name and pasted it instead on top of that, just the way my eyes would have normally seen it. And that is normal JavaScript code that will run. Why is this done? It's done where you don't really need that function again. If I don't need refill coffee again, I'm never going to use it elsewhere in the code, then it's really, there's no need to give it a name. Let's make it anonymous, pass it in only the one time we need it. So we're both declaring the function and passing it in at the same time, and never again being able to refer to it, except for in here, of course, where it's being passed in. Yep.
So why do we need to even pass it as an argument? Why not just, if we're declaring the function inside go to kitchen
That's a
and
really good question.
just write the function inside, like write what it does inside the big function? Why do you have to declare it as an argument?
Why do you have to declare it as an argument? Because you've got this generic function now, go to kitchen and, that you can pass in anything, any other behavior. I'm passing in behavior to this other function.
Yeah, but if you're passing it and declaring it, then just declare whatever function you want it to pass.
Yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily like detrimental to do what we had done earlier, right? Which is to declare it out here. Is that what you're saying?
No, no, no. I'm saying that go to like
Which line?
do Control Z to where it was like an argument.
Yep.
Yeah, and remove function open brackets. Remove the whole argument and just say that go to kitchen and open curly brackets and just console log refilling that coffee.
So like this.
Yeah,
So Bana, right?
yeah,
Bana's question is, why even have the function thing there? Why not just have this curly brackets?
yeah,
That's a good question. Notice the syntax highlighting changes as well.
yeah.
Why? Anybody want to answer that before I take my attempt? Yep.
No, 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 sorry, and I meant like console log going to kitchen and then console log refilling that coffee in one function and just delete everything else.
So in your case, you are console logging.
Delete lines 8 to 12
Oh, okay. Delete this completely.
and write console log going to kitchen and console log refilling that coffee inside the same function.
But then if I have three of those, I'm copying. I'm doing the exact same problem I had earlier, which is I'm copying the
Oh,
same behavior that I had. The whole goal here was this go to kitchen is a big set of instructions, and getting coffee is a big set of instructions. Now I'm pasting, if I'm doing three different go to kitchens and do this or do that, I'm having three different go to kitchen pasted in there. So I was trying to separate go to kitchen from grabbing a coffee, right? That was our original goal. And it's important not to lose sight of that for sure. Now, this, by the way, in terms of syntax, is not a function. What does this look like when it starts with a curly bracket? An object, right? So this is a valid object, but unfortunately we're not doing key value pairs, so it's not even a valid object. So this would just throw a syntax error. Again, some kind of unexpected token type error. Hand? Yeah, object. Great. Great answer. So let's command Z that a little bit. I guess I'll give you a little bit of a teaser, even though I'm not supposed to, which is that this is another syntax for that, but that we'll cover next week. So there is a shorter syntax, but I don't think that's what you were talking about anyway, right? Cool. So here we've got an anonymous function being passed into another function as a task to do after going to the kitchen. Yep, question?
So what happens when our anonymous function takes a argument like thirst? So we would have it take like if thirst, then refill that coffee. If not, then
Right, that's a good question. What happens in this case is a simple example. What happens if the thing actually takes in an argument, the inner function, the function that actually is supposed to grab coffee? Like, for example, the type of coffee, right? You use the example of thirst, but another example would be medium roast, dark roast, tell me the roast. And then it would do the different button on the machine, right? Um, that's something we're going to talk about in the next file that I have. But while also talking about a more realistic example, if that's cool. So I'll defer that answer. Any other questions? Name I forgot already. Nick. is your concern with like why or how? Okay. So how is this working? So we had a couple of things that we built on. One was functions can be values. They can be assigned to variables, like greet was assigned to say hello, right? Which means that we can pass them around. A variable can be passed around into a function. And so what we did was we said, okay, then that means that not only can you pass values to functions, which is data, functions, what are functions? If a 5 or a string is data, what are functions? Behavior. Objects as well, but behavior, right? So really software is made up of two things, in my opinion, data and behavior, right? And so we're saying in JavaScript, we can actually treat them both similarly. That behavior can be passed around just like data. That's another way of looking at what I've explained. In that I'm passing behavior into GoToKitchenAnd, not data. So a function that takes in behavior is what GoToKitchenAnd is. And I'll put that as a comment above. It's another function that it takes in. And then it knows to execute that function because it knows that it's receiving a function that does something. I don't know if that was my attempt at explaining this differently, but I don't know if it landed. Okay, I'll go further, and maybe some more examples of this will help solidify that. If not, perhaps afterwards, like this is where the lab portion and talking to mentors will come into. But it's fair to say, hey, I don't fully get this, because this is kind of getting into more, more advanced things, right? Here's an example that's actually a real-world example of a function that takes in another function that you will start using starting today, tomorrow. It's this right here. Let's say you have the problem of, I have an array, and I want to loop through them, the items in the array, and I want to output each item. I mean, maybe I want to do more with them, but for now, just output each item as a console log. What do I do right now? I would declare a complicated counting loop that would count from 0 to the length of the array. Agreed? Instead, what you can do is this. And this speaks to an example where we are taking an argument. So here what I've done is, let's talk about what this is from a JavaScript perspective. Is this a function call? No, it's not a for loop. It's a function call. There's a function. When you see a dot notation, first of all, on something, what does that remind you of?
Referring to a property within a function.
Nailed it. Referring to a property within an object. And you had mentioned that, I think you had mentioned eraser objects, I can't remember. But like names can have methods on them because names is an array. And so this is actually a function that is a property on the names array. How do I know it's a function? Because of the parentheses in terms of how I'm referring to it. Then what am I doing here? What's this? Because here's where I start calling it. Here's where I stop calling it, right? So everything in between is an argument. And it seems like there's one argument here, which is a function. Agreed? And this function argument is very similar to what we did earlier with refill coffee. I've defined a function without a name. It's an anonymous function that does the and then. Because what for each is basically, for each could be called loop through and then. It's just a more concise name for loop through and then. Do this. Right? And the do this is the behavior. I'm passing in that behavior as a console logger. But it could have been something else. Right? Because that's all I care about doing with each item right now is just console logging them. So I'm passing in what I really want into for each. Yep.
Does for each only work for arrays, or does it work for strings as well?
I believe it's only for arrays, but don't quote me on it. Because you don't normally use for each for objects. I don't think so. Yeah. But I could be wrong on that. Fair thing to experiment. I wouldn't normally experiment, but we're at 10:30, so I'm going to leave it. I'm curious. Now I could have done what we did with coffee, right? Where we defined that function first. And then we just pass in the name of that function, which is what we did very early on with even greet and say hello. We just passed in the name of the function to say, here's the function that I'd like you to execute. Same thing. Right? So if this is easier for you to read, you can write your code today this way. Even though, eventually, if it's a function that you're not going to use more than once, you can just define it and pass it in at the same time, like it was shown earlier. Okay, so I'll show you both examples. And one will be a little bit more difficult to read, but you'll eventually become more comfortable with it, just because it's more effective. Take that function, paste it in here, and don't give it a name. So let's actually run this, because we don't want to be writing too much code and then not running it. Got our array, and we're saying array.forEach, and then we're passing in a callback. And when we run this, it will indeed work like we expect. It's looping through each item and outputting them to each line, because a console log is a new line, right? Pretty neat. You've learned a new way, not only in terms of callbacks, but also in terms of using a function that takes in a callback, which is what this is, and being able to like loop easily. Now, the for loop that you're used to with I equals 0 is a more powerful for loop, right? You can start not at 0, you can start at the end and work backward and things of that nature. Whereas this one is a very special purpose for each, which is start at the beginning, always go to the end, which is often what we're doing with a list of things. Right? But it's not always what we're doing. And so it's not going to solve all your problems, but it's a like common function that you'll use on arrays. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. What if the function actually has a name? So this function's unnamed right now, it's anonymous, but you could name it as well. That's totally okay. It's just and again, this is getting into like philosophy and different conventions. Some companies, fewer companies I would say, in their style guides will say, this is what we want you to do. But most times you'll find it not having a name. I won't get into why. I prefer this, and this is our style here at Lighthouse, and this is what you're going to more encounter later on, is an actually truly anonymous function, not a named function. In this particular use case, right? Yep. Forgot your name. Stella, right? Yeah, so because I've just defined it here and not given it a name, I can't call it. Oh, if I did name it? Yeah, I believe so, because I've defined it essentially in the outer scope, so I should be able to call it, I think. I don't usually try, I haven't tried that, I guess, but it's worth trying. I guess item takes in something, right? I think so, but I'm not sure. Let's try it. I like those kind of questions. Ooh, no. No dice. Learned something. Because it seems like this is on the outer scope, but not quite. Because you're passing it in at the same time, it just behaves differently, I guess?
For the for each, can we, for example, like use that kind of looping to print each name that starts with an H, for example?
Can we use...
Each name that starts with an H, then
Yeah, that's the kind of stuff that you can start doing now, right? You can have a special purpose function here that's not just a print everything, but it's more of a special purpose. I want to go through each resume, and I want only to pick out resumes that have 2 years of experience with JavaScript. I only want to console log those ones. Well, pretend those are resumes. I would have an if statement in my callback function, this function in my inside function, that would actually have an if statement before the console log, right? If years of experience is greater than 2 for JavaScript, something like that.
meant like syntax-wise, like is there a faster way of saying like for each, for example, brackets age or something like, or do we have to actually make the function as
That's the idea here, is that you make the special purpose function that has more logic. Whereas you're calling this generic function, which is not caring if it's resumes or names or anything. It's just an array, and it just calls your callback function to do the actual logic of what to do with each item. Awkward pause. Yep. Never mind. Okay. I have more to do here. I want to actually implement our own for each so we understand how it works. That would be a cool exercise. Right? Using it, okay, cool. I understand the syntax. I can do that. Also, I use the word callbacks. So this here, right here, is, we called it an anonymous function that's being passed in. So inline, I guess. It's passed inline. The way we also refer to these is callbacks. Does anybody want to guess why they're called callbacks? The hint is in the name. Someone else. How about you? Want to take a guess? I don't know your name, sorry.
Me?
Yeah.
Ronan?
Ronan? Why do you think they're called callbacks?
Well, I guess, like, I don't really understand the question, I suppose.
Okay.
What
So
did you ask? What is
so this function here that's being passed in terms of our semantics, is often called a callback function. Why do you think it's called a callback function?
because you're calling a function.
But functions are meant to be called, right? If you have a function, you don't call it, you never execute it, you never run the code in the function. So yes, I agree, the call part is important.
I guess I'm not really sure.
Okay, someone else? Yep.
Could it be that it's looping through the function for each item value? It's just calling it back over and over?
Yeah. It's calling it, the loop part isn't as important, but the fact is that my code isn't calling the function. Notice that I've declared a function. We talked about functions are meant to be called, right? But I didn't call it. This function here, I just passed it in. So it was called back by something else. Right? If this function had a name, which we did earlier with print item, in no place did I call print item. I just referenced it and passed it in. So it was called back by the other function. That's it. That's all that means. It's a function that I don't call explicitly. I just define because I care about that logic, but I don't call it. The other function calls it. It calls me back. It calls my function back. I defined it. I defined print item, but I don't call it. Right? I'll give you an analogy of that, but it seems like there's some questions. Yep, Seb?
So at that point, if the callbacks weren't a thing, even if we did this for each, at the end of it, we'd still have to call back. Or we have to call our function to get it to print out, otherwise it wouldn't do anything. So with callbacks being a part of Java, we don't have to, it'll call back the function itself.
Yeah, let me reiterate the answer because I think I've confused you a little bit. We have defined a function that needs to be called and has specific behavior. So it has to be called, but we don't explicitly call it. Okay? For each is past that function and it calls it back for us. How many times is our function called back? Many times, because in this case it's a loop. In this case it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. And that's why we see 5 console logs, because we have this one function that does that, and we seem to see 5 console logs right here. Right? So we're assigning a function behavior, right? The analogy that I like to use here is we've called someone. So pretend functions are people. Okay? They have behavior. And they can take instructions, right? They can take input. They can give us results. So I call you, and I'm saying, hey, I'm going to give you a task, because that's a behavior. I would like you to call me back every time you encounter a resume that in this pile that that satisfies this condition of whatever. Like I've given you that task, that's function. I've given it to you, right? In this case, it's print every single one or call me back on every one. But it could have been, hey, only console log at a specific time. Here's the instructions, and this function represents those instructions. And then you're saying cool, and then you're actually ringing me back with following those instructions. I'm not following the instructions, but you are. See the difference?
So in the previous example, you know the refill copy, when we were calling a function within a function, that's also a callback function?
Yes. So in the example with refill coffee, do this is the example of a callback function. Great question. I didn't define it there, but yeah, absolutely. So now what we're going to do in the last 10 minutes of lecture is we're going to define for each. It's not going to look very different than our coffee one, which is going to take in a function. But maybe what I'll do is I'll actually do a for each backward because that doesn't exist. So we'll kind of switch it a little bit so that's at least like, oh, we feel like we're building something that's valuable. And then what I'll do is instead of just building it with callbacks, I'll actually build it without callbacks, like a more specific for each backward do X. And then we'll make it generic with for each backward do anything. So let's take a look at what I mean. We're going to call a function that takes in the data. So we're going to call for each backward. Let's call it print each backward. Right? So we're going to start at the end of the array. We're going to work to the beginning, and we're going to print them out. Okay? And in this case, you know what? Let's make them all strings just to keep it simple. Something like this. And I'm going to call print each backward, and I'm going to pass in the data. Notice what I did here, by the way, is a little neat trick that I do. And I'm going to talk about this more in future lectures. Is this going to run?
Not unless you call the print each.
Not unless you declare the print each. Right? That wording is important. Because I'm calling it. So this is going to be a error. And I'm intentionally going to cause the error, and then I'm going to fix the error. This is a process that I like to follow, and I like to teach students to follow, but that'll come in a later lecture. So I'm going to run this code, which is my for each backward, right? And I expect this to throw an error saying that function is not defined. Then I'm going to define it. I could have said the word data in here, but I'm intentionally not naming it the same as the outer variable, okay? Just to not confuse myself. JavaScript's not going to get confused, but I could, right?
Actually, I always think that like I get confused if it's not the same because it's like I always.
I know it's a little bit of a like, you're going to start off being confused if it's not the same, but with more complicated code, you'll get confused if it is the same. So for now, if you're more comfortable with it being the same, that's okay. But maybe also try later on giving it a different name so that you are able to actually follow. Well, yeah, it's called items, but what is items actually coming from? Good point, though. So function for each backward. This is not going to use callbacks, okay? So we're just writing a very normal for loop and just print. Nothing crazy. So here, because I'm working in small steps, I'm not going to go straight to the solution. I'm going to do the bare minimum. So first of all, the error was that the function doesn't exist. I'm going to just write the bare minimum of code to fix that error. This is the bare minimum code. The function now exists. It does nothing, but it's solving that error. So now I have a different hypothesis, which is this code will not say the function is not defined. It will just say, okay, cool. There's nothing being output, and there's no error. So there's actually nothing being said, but there's no error. So I've made a step forward. Then I would just console log items to get familiar with what is items, right? And what I expect it to be is the data that I pass in. So I expect that to get output. Cool. That's working. This incremental style of development is what I'd like you to be following as much as possible when you're working on complicated solutions. Now, I don't really need that console log items. I need to actually loop through the items, right? But instead of starting at 0, where am I going to start? I'm starting at the end, right? So instead of 0, which is the first item in the array, I want to start at? Well, more specifically, what's the number? This is 0, 1, 2, right? So I could hard code it to 2, but I shouldn't. That's bad practice. You're saying it should be data.length, which will work, but in our case, we're calling it items. So it'll be items.length. And actually, items.length is 3. Because I knew that I want to say 2, I'm going to do -1, because we have 0-based indexes. And then What's my next condition? It's my while condition. Keep going while this is true. Yep. Sorry? Yeah, go ahead. Greater than or equal to 0, absolutely. And then? You decrement, right? Decrement by 1. Or I minus equals 1 will do as well. And here, I can just console log I for now, just to make sure I'm decrementing from 210, right? And then I'm going to use 210 to just say item at I is items I. Yes? Fairly straightforward. This is my non-callback implementation. Now the thing is, I may have another scenario where I need to go backward on some other data set, and instead of just console logging it, I may want to have some kind of if condition, only log it if it has a length of 2 or more as a string, right? And then in that case, I would have another function that's called print each backward if greater than 2 or something like that. And now I'm getting into repetitive code, just like with the refill coffee issue, where I was going to the kitchen each time. My loop and looping backward is being repetitive. And so instead, I would actually just do for each backward, similar to the for each, which would not actually do the thing. It would actually be generic, not specialized. It's not actually solving the whole problem, just the outer part of the problem, just like going to the kitchen. And so what it's doing here is saying, okay, I'll loop backward for you, but you decide what you want to do, and I'll call that back. Tell me what that instruction is. Pass it to me. And so we're going to pass in another argument called do this. Now, probably not the best name, but I'm keeping it like that, and we can change it. Another name could be callback, right? Could be called action. Some kind of a verb, right? Because it is a function being called. And instead of actually doing the thing, we're just calling do something. And because we actually need the item to be able to decide what to do with it, we're going to pass the item into it. So this is an example where the callback function takes in an argument, as you were asking about. And now we're going to have to, when we call for each backward, let's do that right below it. We're no longer just passing in the array, we're also passing in a function, which will perhaps have an if statement to say if the item that is passed in has a length greater than 2. Is there any that don't? Maybe greater than 5. Only then do we want to console log them. And we can have many of these for each backward calls that have slightly different behavior being passed into them. How are we doing? So far so good, or not sure? This is kind of the culmination of everything we've been working towards, so I do want to make sure that we're feeling reasonably comfortable with it, or if not, that we talk about that a little bit. I see a reluctant hand in the back.
So at line 18, what is
I guess I scrolled down, sorry. Data is this array at the very top. So that's our data, that's our array. We could have called it array or words. So data is defined up here, and it's referenced down here. It's also referenced here, but I commented that out. That was our previous implementation where we didn't use callbacks, right? Did this one make sense to you where I passed in the array and then I looped through it? Here I'm doing the same thing. I'm passing in the array and then I'm looping through it. It's the first argument, right? Data. Any other questions or kind of misunderstandings or thoughts on this? Will this work? What will this do? What will the output be? Let's comment out the first one. What will the output be of this? Looks like it would be lighthouse only because it's the only one that's greater than 5. The other two is exactly 5, right? Maybe I would want another call here to say I only want to go through the same data and just see exactly which ones are length of 5. And so for that latter output, we would see the other two being output. So in doing this, what we've done is we've kind of exposed how for each kind of works on array. It essentially has a loop like this, except it doesn't go backward. And the callback function that we pass in, so here's the items. The callback function that we pass in simply gets called by the for each. And for each is nice enough to also pass in the item since we need to know what the item is. In fact, we could even pass in the index in case the callback function wants to know which index it's at. Maybe that's relevant to its logic. Not only is it going to look at the length of the string, but where it is in the array. Right? And for each does this as well, where it actually passes in not only the item, but also the index as a second option. Let me show you what I mean. The for each method executes a provided function once for each array element. One sentence, right? Very, very kind of concise definition there. And they do a very similar example to what we had earlier with for each. Because you're calling it on the array, it only needs one argument, which is tell me what to call back each time, right? And in this case, we're just console logging. However, the syntax, take a look at this. Kind of complicated to read. When you call for each on an array, you can give it a function, which it's calling the callback function, and it will be passed in the current value, as well as the index, as well as the entire array itself. And then this is where you put your logic to iterate over each item and what you want to do. Right? And yet it takes an additional argument. We're not going to get into that. You can read up on the documentation for it. So if you don't mind, I'd like us to, at least in some bullets, write down all the takeaways from this lecture as like a closing thing. Is that cool? So what did we learn? I'd like for me to not be the one who says that out. From the beginning, what are the like takeaways that we have so far? What do we got? Yep. So reading code, consider reading it the way it is executed. Instead of reading the contents of each function, only jump to the contents once it is being invoked or executed. That said, you can apply your human intuition as well. What else? Functions are values, right? Functions can be treated just like any other piece of data, right? And the example we saw of this was where we said var say hello is equal to greet, which was a function, where we assigned the function as a value to another array. So that was an interesting takeaway from that. Although we saw evidence of that yesterday as well. Though it wasn't, I don't think it was called out necessarily. Was it called out yesterday? Functions and values, I forget if it's today or yesterday. Either way, you know, assigning it to object properties, same idea, right? What else?
We learned kind of what it means, what an anonymous function is.
Yeah. Therefore, if we can assign functions to variables, we can do this in one step without giving the declared function a name. Therefore, functions can be anonymous. Or defined as a function expression. So function expression, just to recap, was when we did here, where we assigned the function to a variable right off the bat, and it's anonymous, but it's assigned to the variable say hello. Right? But we also then later on used anonymous functions as callback functions by passing them in directly into something like for each. What else? Somebody else that hasn't? Yep.
Write our code by taking our repetitive statements and making it a function, and then take
Yes. I'll rephrase, but I agree. We can dry up our code by defining more generic functions like go to the kitchen and, which take in callback functions and execute them, right? We'll just say it's like this, takes in a callback. And this is not the only way, so we can say one way. A practical example of that is for each, or for each backward, which we created. Right? Any others?
You kind of improved my understanding with function. You said it should just do one thing.
Oh, yes, yes, some good practices, right? Functions should ideally not do more than one thing, right? For each is responsible for looping, but not deciding what to do. We then pass in a callback function that isn't responsible for looping, but does decide what to do with each item within the loop, right? We separated out those two things. Are we feeling good about these kind of takeaways? Yep.
In some of our assignments yesterday, it was talking about helper functions. It's like that kind of in terms of like breaking down into like small as possible functions and then passing them through.
Yeah, helper functions is a good question. What is helper functions? We talked about it yesterday. It's a little bit of um, maybe you could look at it as like an oxymoron, where it's like, well, yeah, all functions are helper functions because they are helping you do something. But sometimes they are that term is used to be like, oh, this function is like just helping this other function do the bigger thing, right? So it's a bit more like it's a sub function or something like that. Similar to what we saw in the calculate day, like the ones inside were like the helper functions. Okay, so we'll leave it there. Everybody feeling good about that? I'll send out the notes. They'll be my previous notes that I normally send with this lecture, and I'll append this to them as well. And the code will be there as a gist as well. Cool? All right, good luck and enjoy the rest of your day. Godspeed.